Welcome to part 6 of the New South and the Wild West. Now we're going to take a look at the emerging civil rights movement. So what do you do if you're an African American in the South in the 1890s, right? You had a taste of equality or near equality for a little while there during Congressional Reconstruction, but Reconstruction's over. That's been all stripped away. Those black codes have returned in the form of Jim Crow laws, restricting where you can get employed or whether or not you can own land, or worse still, your ability to vote. That one piece of power you really finally got, and it's been taken away. Well, there's a lot of people you can turn to, and by 1895, you're going to see a changing of the guard in the civil rights movement, right? Frederick Douglass, who was the former slave / abolitionist and then the champion of civil rights afterwards, dies in 1895. And the next generation of civil rights leaders began to take over, right? People like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington ran a school called the Tuskegee Institute. And at this school, they would teach African Americans different manual labor skills. Get yourself something that gets you a gainfully good paying job, right? But in 1895, he's going to come to the forefront of civil rights by addressing people at the Atlanta Fair. And in the Atlanta Fair, he's going to issue what's called the Atlanta Compromise. And in the Atlanta Compromise, he calls for accommodation. He says that African Americans need to be patient, that they need to accommodate white demands and help themselves. He says they should stay out of politics and pursue vocational training instead, right? By not opposing segregation and by pursuing economic self-reliance and self-improvement, his reason was that African Americans will demonstrate to white America that they are indispensable, that they are essential for the future of America, and therefore this will ensure their future equality, right? This is all well and good, and a lot of people said, oh, this is great, right? But there's some problems with this. On the one hand, accommodation is a really peaceful way to push for equality. But then the question becomes, how long do you wait? How long does it take before white America sees you as equal? 1 year, 1 generation, 10 generations, 100 generations? Never, right? How far do you go? And so while on the one hand, this is a very peaceful and productive way, because remember, he's promoting self-improvement to approach civil rights, there's others that are going to say this is not the direction to go. People like W.E.B. DuBois. Now, 1895 was a pretty pivotal year for DuBois as well. He received his PhD from Harvard University that year. He's the first African American to ever receive a PhD from Harvard. And the process getting there was pretty convoluted, including doing some of his graduate work in Scotland, right? But he is going to say that that Booker T. Washington is absolutely wrong. Now, in 1909, he is going to co-found the NAACP with other African American leaders, including Ida B. Wells Barnett, right? And he's going to criticize Booker T. Washington's idea of accommodation. He's even going to write a book that will be published in 1903 on this called The Souls of Black Folk. The Souls of Black Folk is a direct challenge to Washington's accommodations theory, saying that Booker T. Washington is wrong, that accommodation does nothing but keep the black man down. It doesn't free him at all. And he offers a counterpoint. He says the only way you're ever going to get any change is through agitation. You have to get in their face. You have to let them know, we demand change now, right? You got to shake some sabers. Now, on the one hand, this is possibly more effective, right? It certainly gets that issue right up into people's face. But the downside of this, of course, is that it may promote violence in doing this. And this is exactly what we're going to see. There's a lot more violence in the post-Civil War era in the form of lynchings, especially against African Americans, right? Between 1882 and 1968, there were 4,742 lynchings in the United States. 3,445 of those were perpetrated against African Americans. people like Ida B. Wells are going to research some of this stuff. The whole reason why she became an anti-lynching crusader as well as a civil rights activist was because of what happened to some friends of hers. She actually had a friend of hers get lynched in 1892. His name was Thomas Moss, and he, with Calvin McDowell and Henry Stewart, owned a grocery store called the People's Grocery Company, an African American grocery store. It's a small grocery store, but the white store owners in the areas felt that they were taking customers away from them. So they went to come vandalize their grocery store. Now, what Moss, McDowell, and Stewart did was they defended their store. And in the process of doing that, several white vandals were shot. So, of course, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart were arrested for defending their store. While they were in jail, a lynch mob descended on the jail, broke them out, and hung them from the trees out in front of the courtyard of the jail itself, right? This is what got Ida B. Wells doing research into lynchings. Now, the one thing in Ida B. Wells' research in lynchings in the United States is that she found that in most cases, when a lynching took place, there had actually been no crime committed at all, right? Only the perception of a crime. And it leads to one of the most famous lynchings in U.S. history, specifically because of the court case that resulted from it. The trial in question is the trial of Sheriff Joseph Shipp. And the story begins in 1906 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, when a woman named Nevada Taylor was assaulted near her home and raped. She's 21 years old. Sheriff Joseph Shipp led the investigation, but Nevada Taylor didn't give him a whole lot to go on. When she tried to describe the man that assaulted her, all she could tell Sheriff Shipp was that he was strong and had a soft, kind voice. She said she wasn't sure what the man looked like, but he might be black, right? Based on that evidence, Sheriff Joseph Shipp arrested Ed Johnson, an African-American carpenter, okay? And then he began putting together a fast track to trial, right? Matter of fact, the trial began a week after the arrest had been made, okay? The witnesses brought for the prosecution all brought forward circumstantial evidence at best, really sketchy eyewitness testimony and things like that, placing Ed Johnson at the scene. Ed Johnson, on the other hand, though, had a pretty watertight case. He could not have been the man that assaulted her. Matter of fact, he had 13 witnesses that testified that Ed Johnson had been working at the Last Chance Saloon across town at the time that the assault took place. It is impossible for him to have been there and have raped Nevada Taylor. Matter of fact, at one point, a member of the jury stood up and shouted out to Nevada Taylor, said, "Are you sure this is the man who assaulted you?" And she looked at the jurist and said, "I will not swear that he is the man, but I believe he is the Negro who assaulted me." Despite all of this evidence to the contrary, Ed Johnson was found guilty and he was sentenced to be executed. He was going to be executed on March 13th, 1906, right? Now, that's a very short time from the time of his conviction here in early February. The clock is ticking. On February 12, 1906, Johnson appealed his decision and requested a new trial, right? On March 3rd, 1906, the Tennessee Supreme Court refused his appeal. So 4 days later, on March 7th, he filed a petition of a writ of habeas corpus in federal courts, citing numerous constitutional violations, including his 14th Amendment rights. Now, the federal courts upheld the conviction. He was still then, therefore, slated for the hangman's noose, but issued a 1-week stay of execution to allow the U.S. Supreme Court to decide whether or not they wanted to hear the case. So his execution was moved to March 20th, 1906. On March 18th, the Supreme Court announced that they were going to hear the case. The next evening at 8 p.m., around 200 men descended on the jail where Johnson was being held and broke in. It was a 2-story jailhouse, and a couple strange things had happened that day. First of all, usually there was 4 or 5 guards on duty. That night there was only one. Jeremiah Gibson was the only guard on station that night. The other guards were not present. Also, all the people in the jail on the second floor, with the exception of Ed Johnson and a woman, had been moved down to the first floor. So when the men, 200 men strong, broke into the jail, passed by Jeremiah Gibson, and went up to the second floor, the only thing they didn't have was a key to the cell. And for the next 2 hours, they spent their time trying to cut through the bars to get to Ed Johnson. They knew that was the guy they were going after, all right? The woman will later testify that she told Ed Johnson, this is the time to start praying. And Ed Johnson had, for 2 hours, got to watch in horror as these men tried to break into his jail. Once they got in, they took him out to the Walnut Street Bridge, tied a noose around his neck, and tossed him over the side. After about 90 minutes, they hoisted him up, and he still wasn't dead, and so they shot him multiple times too. Now, the Supreme Court was outraged by this killing of Ed Johnson, the lynching of him. Why? Well, they were going to hear his case on the 20th. And now they don't have to, because now he's dead. So for the first and only time in U.S. history, the Supreme Court of the United States, which remember is an appellate court, is going to initiate a criminal trial. They are going to put on trial Sheriff Joseph Shipp, Jailer Jeremiah Gibson, and the 4 leaders of the lynch mob who had attacked the jail that night. What did they try them for? Lynching? Well, no, there's no federal crime against lynching at this time. Murder? No. Criminal contempt of court? Oh, yeah, no, we'll get that. Obstruction of justice. They charged them with criminal contempt, right? And in the end, Joseph Shipp and the leader of the ringleader of the lynch mob will get 90 days in jail, and Jeremiah Gibson and the other three ringleaders are going to get 60 days in jail. Their conviction will come through on the 15th of November in 1909. And that will be the extent of the Supreme Court's penalty for lynching an innocent man.